Week 5 is officially underway, and today I got you guys covered with my wide receiver rankings in the tier list format I bring you guys every week, going through my wide receiver 1s, my wide receiver 2s, my wide receiver 3s, and my favorite flex plays going into week 5 of fantasy football. Before we get into the rankings tier list itself, this would typically be where I'd go through the will they play tier. There's no real questionables going into Saturday morning as I'm currently recording. Again, if there's anything that is released later today on Saturday, I'll make sure that is updated in the pinned comment for you guys. So in terms of the will they play, we don't really have to go through that. However, I will go through the guys that are already ruled out and are on bye week for this week. Make sure you set your lineup. Again, if you're watching us, I'm assuming you know how to set your lineup going into Sunday. But with that being said, these guys will not be available. We're starting off with Malik Neighbors, Devontae Adams, Khalil Shakir, who were all ruled out going into week 5. And of course, the constants from past weeks. Cooper Kupp, obviously, Puka Nacua, both Rams wide receivers still on the shelf. And obviously Rashee Rice as well after that ACL potential injury he suffered last Sunday. In terms of the bye weeks, you're without your Eagles, you're without your Lions, you're without your Chargers, you're without your Titans. So if you do have A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Ladd McConkey, and the two Titan guys with DeAndre Hopkins and Calvin Ridley, remember to take them out of your lineup. But waste no more time. Let's go into the wide receiver 1s, and let's start off with my wide receiver 1 on the slate. We got CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys, 20.25 implied Cowboys points this week on the road against the Pittsburgh Steelers. This is the Sunday night game. I'm going to be live for it. I'm going to be ready for it, man. I'm hoping we're able to take the dub, but all jokes aside, CeeDee Lamb is the definition of an alpha wide receiver 1. It is a relatively tough matchup against a good Pittsburgh Steelers secondary, but with no Brandon Cooks and a struggling run game in Dallas, I mean, this offense is going to go through CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson. I think those are the two key pillars of this offense. We know CeeDee Lamb what he is, superstar level talent. Yes, the matchup isn't great, but the target volume and offensive viability alone are going to be able to make him a high-end wide receiver 1 on a week-to-week basis. He's been fine to start the season. We haven't really seen the full CeeDee Lamb breakout week. I think it's coming soon, and of course, CeeDee Lamb is going to be a staple at the top of these wide receiver rankings every week. Moving on to wide receiver 2, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans, 24 implied Texans points at home against the Buffalo Bills this week. And Nico Collins has taken that full step towards superstardom. You guys see the tweet on the screen from Vert. But Nico Collins, for the first quarter of the season, through the first 4 games, he is first in the NFL in receiving yards, first in the NFL in receptions of 10-plus yards, first in receptions of 20-plus yards, first in first down receptions, and first in 100-yard games. This guy is a freak in nature, like I said, has already ascended towards the top 3 to 5 level NFL talent at the wide receiver position, and we know he is insulated in this Texans offense. No Joe Mixon again this week, and we have seen the Texans have the #1 usage at the wide receiver position so far. Jamar Chase comes at 23.25 implied Bengals points at home against the Ravens this week. Divisional affair, back-to-back 20-plus point PPR performances for Chase after that slow start that the Bengals had in the first 2 games. It looks like they're finally clicking. Joe Burrow's looking like an MVP candidate. Jamar Chase is still the stud wide receiver 1 we drafted him to be. You're firing him in with top 3 to 5 level confidence. He comes in for me at wide receiver 3. And the other LSU wide receiver, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, 21.5 implied Vikings points in London at 9:30. Again, make sure you're setting your lineup early, 9:30 a.m. Eastern kickoff time. So make sure you do get that lineup in. But with Justin Jefferson, the thesis coming into the year was that he was already an undeniable wide receiver talent, but the offense wouldn't be able to prop him up. Right now, Sam Darnold's a top 5 candidate in terms of MVP betting odds. This Vikings offense looks very good, and Justin Jefferson is delivering as advertised, over 20-plus PPR points per game. Yes, it's a tough matchup. Yes, he's going to see a lot of Sauce Gardner in this game, but Justin Jefferson is the one wide receiver that I simply don't care who's covering him. He may very well end up being the best wide receiver of all time by the time he hangs his cleats up. So we're still firing him with top 5 confidence. To wide receivers 5 and 6, we have Deebo Samuel and Marvin Harrison Jr. Big-time pivotal divisional matchup this week. The Cardinals traveling to Santa Clara to take on the Niners. Niners implied for 28.75 points. The Arizona Cardinals this week are implied for 21.25. So start with Deebo Samuel. He is my number 5. When we look at the usage in week 5 coming back from the injury, he was able to still have over 80% of the team routes and a 20% targets per route run rate. We saw what he was able to do in the first 2 weeks, a top 15 wide receiver in fantasy each of those two weeks. We don't know what we're going to get from Brandon Ayuk. I mean, I'm going to cover him later in this video. George Kittle's obviously coming into the game banged up with that groin injury. And Deebo Samuel is a do-it-all playmaker. We know what he's able to do, commanding targets, a 27% target share on the year. And we also know he's going to take some backfield touches with no Christian McCaffrey in the lineup. Jordan Mason's going to be the main RB1, but I would not be shocked if Deebo Samuel against Arizona was able to get, 5 to 8 carries in this game, also supplemented by the high volume he's going to get in the receiving game. He is one of those do-it-all wide receivers like a Jaden Reed, where, quite simply, because of their involvement in the offense, they're never going to be outside of this range, in my opinion. Deebo Samuel, we know the offense is good. We know they're implied for a ton of points. And we know this guy's going to touch the pigskin quite often in this game. And the same goes for Marvin Harrison Jr. In the last 3 games he has played after that week 1 stinker, only 1.4 PPR points in week 1. Since that game in weeks 2 to 4, 38% target share, 31% target share, 27% target share in each of the last 3 games. Wide receiver 1, wide receiver 18, and wide receiver 25 weekly finish. He's finding his own as that stud alpha wide receiver 1 he was drafted to be, and in an offense that still has some upside. I mean, we know this Niners defense is good. The overall Arizona offense is still implied for nearly 22 points this week. Marvin Harrison Jr. is already an alpha. Trey McBride's coming into this game banged up. And we know Kyler, when he's making plays, when he's extending time in the pocket, will want to hit his 6'4", 200-pound threat. And that is exactly what Marvin Harrison Jr. is, that absolute beast on the outside. Wide receiver 7, 10, and 12 actually already played on Thursday night. My wide receiver 7 was Chris Godwin. 6 targets, 5 receptions, 64 receiving yards, 11.6 PPR points. Drake London, monster performance on Thursday night. 13 targets, 12 receptions, 154 yards, and a receiving touchdown for 33.4 PPR points. And then, of course, Mike Evans was able to score those 2 touchdowns, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 62 receiving yards, and, of course, those 2 touchdowns to supplement a 23.2 PPR performance. Exactly what we wanted. Again, maybe you would have wanted a little bit more for Chris Godwin. I think going into the game, the slot matchup against the Falcons would have implied for more Chris Godwin production. But overall, if you did have some players on Thursday night, you can't complain about a 36-30 game because typically those games are like 13-10. Wide receiver 8, Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers, 25.75 implied Packers points this week on the road in LA. With Jaden Reed, it may seem high on surface level, but when you contextualize the fact he has been a top 2 wide receiver in the 2 starts that Jordan Love has made this year, you could even argue that it's too low, to be honest. Very ideal matchup, very ideal offensive situation for Reed. No Christian Watson, no Romeo Doubs in this game, and there is no reason to doubt him after what he's shown with Jordan Love. I think Dontavian Wicks is a great play in his own right. But you'd be foolish to not consider Jaden Reed the wide receiver 1 on the Packers moving forward, especially with how good this Packers offense has looked. We want pieces of it. Jordan Love's my quarterback 4 on the slate. Jaden Reed is my wide receiver 8. And then 9 is DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks, 24.75 implied Seahawks points at home against the Giants this week. Seattle's offense has simply looked incredible to start the year, and Ryan Grubb has truly unlocked DK Metcalf back to that year 2 form. After DK's second year, we're talking about, is this guy on a superstar trajectory? He had over 1,300 yards, was a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. We're starting to see that DK Metcalf materialize back. He looks, in my opinion, like a top 12, top 10 level wide receiver in fantasy moving forward, given the context of this offense. Geno's leading the league in passing yards, and DK Metcalf is a big play threat on any given play. This Hawks offense looks explosive, and I want pieces of it moving forward, and specifically DK Metcalf as the best piece that I want. And then finally, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints comes in at 11. Of course, I mentioned my 7, 10, and 12 with the Falcons Buccaneers game on Thursday night. With Chris Olave, obviously Monday Night Football against the Kansas City Chiefs on the road, 19 implied Saints points in this game. And after a bad week 1, he has been a top 24 wide receiver in each of the last 3 games. And while it is a tough matchup against Trump, McDuffie, and co. with the Kansas City Chiefs, he has been an alpha for an offense that has overperformed expectations. Again, we'll talk about Rashid Shaheed in a bit. Maybe you can consider the gap closed moving forward. However, I do think Chris Olave will start to establish himself as the clear number 1 on this team, and I think he is top 10 level upside moving forward if this offense keeps performing at the level it has. Again, tough matchup, but what we've seen from Clint Kubiak has been nothing short of spectacular through 4 games. But you guys need to start these wide receiver 1s like I mentioned at the top. So now let's spend some more time on my wide receivers 13 to 36. Again, I'm going to be going through my full top 36 wide receiver rankings. If you guys want to see all of my rankings, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, updated as soon as Sunday morning, You guys can get it over on flockfantasy.com. Promo code FSC will get you a 7-day free trial, as well as 30% off any site-wide package, as well as if you go over to Underdog Fantasy, if you use promo code FSC, sign up and first deposit at least $10, you play one contest, and you'll be able to get access to our weekly rankings manifesto moving forward. It is the #1 tool you need for the fantasy football season. But moving off of that, let's go to the wide receiver 13 in my ranking, Stefon Diggs of the Houston Texans. I have been a Stefon Diggs hater, quote unquote, so far, but I really do think this is a smash spot. Obviously, the rematch, the revenge game narrative going up against his former team with the Buffalo Bills. This game's in Houston. Houston is implied for 24 points. And like I mentioned with Nico Collins, the Texans are currently the #1 team in wide receiver usage in the NFL for fantasy point production. There's no Joe Mixon again in this game. You're not going to establish the run with Cam Akers. And I do think that the Texans lean on their superpower. That is their passing game. Stefon Diggs has been getting great looks underneath. We know what Nico Collins and Tank Dell are able to do affecting the third level. Stefon Diggs is their glue guy. He's their slot wide receiver. He runs all of the underneath routes. And I do think Stefon Diggs is primed to see a ton of volume again this week. 22% target share on the season, and he's averaging 15.5 PPR points per game. And with Tank Dell coming back, running his designated post shots, designated deep shots, designated clear routes, we saw what Stefon Diggs is able to do against a two-eye shell, which is what Buffalo has predominantly run from this year. Next up is Tyreek Hill coming in at 14, 17.5 implied Dolphins points on the road against the Patriots. On one hand, again, very low implied total. Snoop Huntley starting again. Tyreek Hill should face a ton of Christian Gonzalez. It really depends what Snoop Huntley we get. Do we get the guy that looked lost last week, or do we get the guy that was able to support Mark Andrews in fantasy 2 years ago with another week working in the Mike McDaniel scheme? I do think there's a possibility we see Snoop Huntley, the guy that was the Pro Bowl alternate just a couple years ago. People can argue in the comment section if that was deserved or not. Amari Cooper comes in at wide receiver 15, 20.25 implied Browns points on the road against the Commanders this week. And I mentioned it in yesterday's Sneaky Starts video. If you guys didn't already watch that, make sure you do watch that. That was a video where if you are decimated by injuries, if you're decimated by bye weeks, you need guys to fill into your lineup. I mentioned that I really like the outlook for Deshaun Watson against Washington. And we see for Amari Cooper's sake that Washington is actually the #2 matchup against opposing wide receivers this year. They can't cover a nosebleed. We know Amari Cooper is demanding targets in this offense. It's just a matter of if Deshaun Watson is at least functional, I think he's going to be able to pay off as a wide receiver too. And given the context of the matchup, I do think Deshaun Watson may very well have his best game of the season. We saw what that looked like a couple weeks ago for Amari Cooper, where he had over 27 PPR points when the offense was actually humming at its full capacity. Deontay Johnson comes in at 16, wide receiver of the Carolina Panthers, and there's really no reason for him not to be considered at least a mid-end wide receiver 2 at this point. In the last 2 weeks with Andy Dalton, he has been a top 10 wide receiver in each of those weeks, over 20 plus PPR points in each of those weeks. And when we look at the usage itself, a 38% target share and a 34% target share with Andy Dalton at quarterback. I do downgrade him a little bit because this is a very tough matchup against Chicago this week. But with this type of usage in this offense, I don't think we can consider Deontay Johnson anything else but a weekly top 15 to 20 wide receiver, and potentially in some matchups, a top 12 to 15 wide receiver. Wide receiver 17 for me is Dontavian Wicks of the Green Bay Packers. I already mentioned the overall implied total of the Packers when I talked about Jaden Reed, but this is a smash spot for Dontavian Wicks. He may very well be a guy that you just scooped off of waivers at Tuesday, at Wednesday, whenever your waivers process in your league, and you can plug into your lineup right away. Again, this is a Green Bay offense we want to be targeting, and we saw last week in the first game with over 80% of the routes on the season, Dontavian Wicks absolutely feasted. We know Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs are out for this game, and I expect that to continue moving forward for Wicks. I broke it all down on yesterday's video as well for Wicks, but when we're looking at the situation, he actually got better usage than Jaden Reed last week. Again, Reed is still the wide receiver 1. He's still a top 10 wide receiver for me, but I do think Dontavian Wicks can be started with top 20 level confidence. The same goes for Brian Thomas Jr., rookie wide receiver of the Jacksonville Jaguars. 24.5 implied Jags points at home against the Colts. Divisional matchup. We'll talk about a couple Colts wide receivers in a little bit, but Brian Thomas Jr. has been an absolute stud in the first month of his NFL career. And if Trevor Lawrence connected with him a couple more times down the field, we could be talking about this guy as a week-to-week top 12 to 15 wide receiver. Fastest paced game of the entire slate with the Colts and Jaguars, and the 5th highest implied over-under of the entire slate. The Colts have been fried by vertical outside wide receivers all year. We're thinking of Nico Collins. We're thinking of Rome Odunze. We're thinking of George Pickens. And I do think Brian Thomas Jr. is the next in line to absolutely cook against the secondary. Moving on to low-end wide receiver 2s, and my wide receiver 19 this week is Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. I get it. You guys are probably watching this like, dude, like Brandon Ayuk has been in my lineup each of the last 3 weeks, and he's done nothing. Like, why is he a top 20 wide receiver? Why are you continually going back to him? And when it comes down to it for me, I just keep looking at the talent. I just keep looking at the usage. And I just keep looking at the situation. Over 28 implied points, nearly 29 implied points against the Cardinals secondary that has simply struggled this year. And until he plays like himself, I can't put him back to the top 12 to 15 status like his teammate Deebo Samuel is going to be considered on a week-to-week basis. But as soon as Brandon Ayuk just has his get-right game, I mean, we've seen both Jamar Chase, both CeeDee Lamb started slow at the beginning of the year. It seems like a common theme with these holdout wide receivers, and hopefully this is the Brandon Ayuk get-right spot. He's too good of a player and too good of a situation to continually disappoint like he has been. And the same applies for Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, 19 implied Jets points in that London game against the Vikings this week. He's top 10 in the NFL in targets per game, but he simply has not been playing good football so far. Connection between him and Rodgers has been slow, and now he faces a potential shadow matchup against Stephon Gilmore, who has quietly been one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL to start the season so far. I'm sick of talking about peripherals with Garrett Wilson, his target share, his route running, win rates, this and that. I'm tired of talking about that. Can this brother just go out there and have a fucking good game? That is what I'm hoping for at this point. Again, sorry for a little bit of the rambling. He still has to be a top 20 wide receiver for me because of the volume he's seen from Rodgers, but I wouldn't blame you if you're on your last straw with him. Wide receiver 21 is Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders, 23.25 implied Commanders points against the Browns. I already talked about Amari Cooper earlier in this video. The reason why I have Terry McLaurin as wide receiver 21 is that despite this offense looking phenomenal, again, #1 in EPA so far this year, despite the fact that Terry McLaurin has been a target commanding alpha wide receiver, this is a very difficult matchup for him on the outside. We're expecting a lot of Denzel Ward on him. If not, we're also going to see some Martin Emerson. I could see a world where the Cleveland Browns defense concentrates all their efforts to slowing down Terry McLaurin in the vertical passing game that Washington has seen thus far. That's why I talked about Zach Ertz being a sneaky start this week, because I think the entirety of the Cleveland Browns' attention will be on Terry McLaurin on the outside. Again, still a top 24 wide receiver for me. This offense is too good. He's been too involved as a player to have lower than this. But monitor the situation, because I do think this could potentially be a volatile week for McLaurin in this offense. Wide receiver 22 for me is T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. He's quietly commanded a ton of volume since returning from that hamstring injury. He just simply hasn't had his blow-up week. However, we did see 2 weeks removed from the injury this past week, a 32% target share for T. Higgins, 85% of the team routes. Again, he just hasn't had the blow-up week this week. However, high implied over-under in this game. Divisional matchup between the Bengals and Ravens. I think this is a potential get-right spot, especially considering the fact this Bengals passing offense has been magnificent in the last 2 weeks. Wide receiver 23 for me is DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. I already mentioned Deontay Johnson in this game, but we have 22.5 implied Bears points at home against the Panthers. 26% target share for DJ Moore this year. The unfortunate part, though, is that Caleb Williams has simply been inconsistent in terms of production this year. We'll get into Rome Odunze in a little bit, but I do think this is a potential get-right spot for Caleb Williams. I believe in this offense. I believe in Caleb Williams' talent level, and I do think if there's any spot for this entire passing attack to get right, it's going to be against the Panthers defense that, like I said, hasn't been able to stop anybody this year. And finally, Xavier Worthy comes in as my wide receiver 24 this week, 24.5 implied Chiefs points at home Monday Night Football this week. And he receives a roll bump with the news of Rashee Rice's injury, and he is the primary deep threat for Mahomes on this offense. We saw his route share increase last week once Rice got hurt to 85% of the team routes, and as a result, he was a top 24 wide receiver, caught that deep bomb, 16.3 PPR points. He was the wide receiver 23 in week 4. Despite the struggles of the Kansas City passing attack thus far, we know Worthy is the type of player that can change the complexion of your fantasy lineup on one single play. If we do see the target share go up a little bit, I think we could be talking about wide receiver 24 as the floor for Worthy moving forward, especially if Mahomes figures out his shit. Moving on to the wide receiver 3s, we start off with George Pickens as my wide receiver 25 this week, 22.75 implied Steelers points at home. Trayvon Diggs and Kalen Carson were both on the injury report for the Cowboys secondary this week, and we already know the Cowboys will be without their two best pass rushers in this game. George Pickens has quietly had his best NFL season so far this year, and I do think this is a potential spot with banged up corners and no potential pass rush that the Steelers offense can put some points on the board against my beloved Dallas Cowboys. This isn't the Sunday night game. I'm hoping that's not the case. However, Pickens does have a pretty good advantage if either of those corners are entering the game banged up. And like I said, Fields should have all day in the pocket with no Micah Parsons and no DeMarcus Lawrence. Wide receiver 26 is Jackson Smith and Jigba of the Seattle Seahawks. And with JSN, I'm really just trusting the Seahawks passing offense. Like I said earlier with DK, Geno is leading the league in passing yards so far. And while JSN has been very volatile this year, balancing big performance with dud, I do think this is a potential spot where he can start building some more week-to-week consistency and establish himself in this top 25 range moving forward. Christian Kirk comes in at wide receiver 27 for me, 24.5 implied Jax points like I mentioned with Thomas, and I love Kirk's matchup this week. Evan Ingram is still questionable at this point. If he does miss, it is absolute wheels up for Christian Kirk. 15 plus PPR points in back-to-back games with no Evan Ingram. And like I mentioned earlier, the Colts secondary cannot stop a nosebleed. High-paced game, high over-under game. I love Kirk to potentially feast going from that slot wide receiver position. Wide receiver 28 for me is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. Nearly 26 implied Ravens points at 25.75 this week. On one hand with Zay Flowers, you could talk about the fact that the Ravens going off the big leads in the last 2 weeks are due for some positive regression in terms of game scripts in the passing game. On the other hand, the Ravens just decimated two very good NFL teams in back-to-back weeks in the last two, and Derrick Henry has been unbelievable to start the year. He's been the big workhorse in the NFL, 6 yards per carry so far this year, seamless fit behind this Ravens offensive line. And although Cincy can't cover wide receivers to start this year, and I do expect this game to be close and high scoring, there is still the chance that the Ravens ground game gets going and absolutely dominates on Sunday. Again, with Zay Flowers, he has a high-end target share and has high-end yak ability, but I just hope that the Ravens are actually forced to throw the football in this game. Next up at 29, we have Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. I already talked about his two teammates in depth, but with Tank Dell, we know his role on this offense. We do want the target share to go up moving forward. He's been more of a high teens player rather than a plus 20% target share player. We know Nico Collins obviously dominating in that regard. Stephon Diggs, 22% seasonal target share. But I would also argue that he's been very unlucky getting missed down the field. A bunch of times off of play action, him and CJ Stroud just have not been able to connect. And it's really a matter of when, not if, they are able to connect. We know Tank Dell, what he's able to do, working down the field, big play threat. I do think this is a potential get-right spot in what should be a high-scoring game environment against this Buffalo Bills team. And then wide receiver 30, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings, 21.5 implied Vikings points like I mentioned with Jettas. With Jordan Addison, he returned to the lineup in week 4 and already scored 2 touchdowns. The way I view Jordan Addison is that while Jettas is the clear one on this team, Kevin O'Connell does a very good job, concentrated looks to Addison, getting him the ball in space, designating some, double moves, deep shots down the field. To me, when I look at Jordan Addison, he almost reminds me of like the Jaden Reed of this offense. We know what Justin Jefferson is, bona fide superstar, number 1 elite wide receiver. But Jordan Addison, the way he's able to impact the game, both with his yak ability and working down the field, making big plays, like I said, kind of reminds me of the Minnesota version of Jaden Reed at this point. Wide receivers 31 and 32 both play for the Indianapolis Colts. I mentioned their flip side of the matchup with the Jags wide receivers, but Michael Pittman is my 31 and Josh Downs is my 32 this week, 21.5 implied Colts points. And since Josh Downs has come back from injury, he's actually outproduced Michael Pittman in fantasy. So for those of you that are wondering, Michael Pittman's the clear one, why is Josh Downs even close to him? Josh Downs has actually gotten more utilization in the last couple of weeks. 32% target share, 36 targets per route run in the last couple of weeks, on top of 13.7 PPR points. Again, Michael Pittman's still going to be doing his thing. But the other implied factor of this game is whether it's Anthony Richardson or Joe Flacco. They're currently, wide receiver 3s for me, assuming that Anthony Richardson suits up. But if Joe Flacco suits up, you can even make the case both are top 25, at the very minimum top 30 level options in fantasy this week. Joe Flacco, again, he's not Anthony Richardson from a big play standpoint, but what he does in terms of passing volume, getting these guys looks in terms of their overall targets is what we're looking for. So in terms of fantasy football, we're actually hoping that Joe Flacco is the one that suits up this week. Wide receivers 33 and 35 respectively for me also play against each other, are rookies in this game. Xavier Legette of the Carolina Panthers at 33, Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears as my wide receiver 35. 22.5 implied Bears points, 18.5 implied Carolina points. But the reason why I love Leggett this week specifically, again, it is a very tough matchup against the Bears secondary, but what we were able to see from Leggett in terms of his usage was that of something we haven't seen so far this year. Over 80% of the team routes, and as we know with Dave Canales, he's actually schemed him some very good looks to take advantage of the height, weight, speed that Leggett brings to the table. He was a top 8 wide receiver for me in the prospect cycle, and my comp for him was kind of a mix of a Deebo Samuel, A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf composite in the sense that I don't think he's quite the route runner separator that A.J. Brown was, but I also thought he was a better horizontal athlete than what DK Metcalf brought to the table. On top of that, I mean, we know the size, we know the speed, 4.39 speed. I'm really excited for Xavier Leggett moving forward now that he has established himself as the number 2 weapon and what has been a very good performing Carolina offense with Andy Dalton as the quarterback. On the flip side, Rome Odunze has all the talent in the world. He was a top 3 wide receiver for me in the class. We know what he's able to do at his time in Washington. But so far, Caleb in this offense just has simply been dysfunctional. Like I mentioned with DJ Moore, I do think greater times are ahead. This is a smash spot to get right for the passing offense. And Rome Odunze is running over 80% of the routes, despite only having really 1 fantasy-relevant performance thus far. I think he's going to get back on track this week after only 2 PPR points last week. And we could potentially see Rome Odunze get back to his week 3 levels. Our receiver 34 for me is Rashid Shaheed of the New Orleans Saints. 19 implied Saints points this week. And you can even make the argument that the discrepancy I have between him and Olave is too large. I do think Olave will start to show out as the main alpha wide receiver 1, but so far this year, Shaheed has basically been a 1A or 1B situation with Olave, and in fact, you can even make the case he has outperformed Olave so far. 27% target share so far this season, 13.7 PPR points, and 3 games of over 15 PPR points so far. I understand that the matchup is difficult, and like I said, I do expect Olave to take more of a role moving forward, but I think Shaheed at this point has to be considered a strong week-to-week flex play. Wide receiver 36, and closing off this tier list, we have Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins, 17.5 implied Dolphins points, like I mentioned with Tyreek, and he's someone where I really don't know what to do with like Tyreek Hill, because I can't rank him in the same stratosphere as Tyreek Hill, given the fact that Tyreek Hill may very well be the best wide receiver walking on earth. However, with Jalen Waddle, he had over a 30% target share from Snoop Huntley. And like I mentioned, I could see a potential increase in play for Huntley moving forward. More practice time with these guys, more rapport in terms of developing timings down the field. Maybe we see a couple of those missed shots down the field actually be converted moving forward. Again, I'm not very optimistic. This is a very low implied spot for this Dolphins offense. But Jalen Waddle is just simply too good of a player for me to actually have on my bench, and knowing the fact that he had over 30% of the targets. If Huntley, like I said with Tyreek, is close to the guy that was able to support Mark Andrews at the end of 2022, rather than the guy that we saw in his first start, I think Jalen Waddle could be much better moving forward. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. And like I mentioned in the middle of the video, if you want access to our weekly rankings manifesto, there is one of 2 ways to get it right now. FlockFantasy.com, promo code FSC will get you 30% off of any site-wide package, as well as a 7-day free trial on the site. As well as Underdog Fantasy, promo code FSC, sign up and first deposit, make 1 play on the site for at least $10. You'll be able to get our weekly rankings moving forward. Appreciate you guys for that consistent support. Drop your biggest start-sit decisions. I'll try to get to as many as possible in the comments. Good luck in your week 5 matchups. Let's secure those W's, baby.